It's a cool evening in San Francisco, 2013. Inside San Quentin State Prison, one of the oldest and most notorious prisons in California, the atmosphere is tense. San Quentin houses some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, including violent offenders and career criminals who have been hardened by years of imprisonment. On the surface, everything seems calm. But beneath the surface, a plan is being set into motion that will send shockwaves through the prison system and the entire nation. For months, 3 inmates, Richard Dickie Williams, Thomas Tommy King, and Daryl D. Davis, had been silently planning their escape. It wasn't just an act of desperation, it was an act of defiance. These men had spent years behind bars, enduring inhumane conditions, overcrowding, and the relentless oppression of the prison system. But there was one thing they had in common. They had a plan, and they were willing to risk everything for a shot at freedom. They had been quietly working on an elaborate escape plan, using whatever resources they could find. Prisoners inside San Quentin knew that escape was nearly impossible, but Williams, King, and Davis had an edge. They had knowledge of the prison's structure and an underground network of inmates who could help them execute the plan. But what made this escape so daring and so dangerous was their timing. They knew that the guards would be distracted that night due to a major prison event taking place in the main yard. The escape had to happen then, when the attention of the entire prison would be elsewhere. The clock was ticking. The plan was in motion, but the tension in the air was unbearable. Richard Dickie Williams, Thomas Tommy King, and Daryl D. Davis had successfully navigated through the underground tunnels beneath San Quentin State Prison, each step bringing them closer to freedom. But the prison walls, thick and unforgiving, loomed larger than ever. With every passing moment, the risk of getting caught skyrocketed, and the consequences of failure were clear: a life sentence or worse. The escape was nearly flawless. The inmates had carefully mapped out their route, each exit point and weak spot in the prison's security system. The guards, distracted by the ongoing event in the yard, had no idea what was happening in the underground tunnels, but that didn't mean the path to freedom was free of obstacles. As they neared the final stretch, Williams, King, and Davis reached the outer perimeter of the prison. This was the most crucial part of the plan, getting past the high fences and electrified barbed wire that surrounded the prison. They had managed to disable the security systems temporarily by using makeshift tools and carefully timed distractions. It was a tight window, and they knew they had to move fast. But just as they reached the final gate, everything started to fall apart. One of the guards, stationed at a distant tower, had noticed something off. A glimmer of movement caught his eye through his scope, and for a split second, he questioned whether it was just a trick of the light. But instinct kicked in. He radioed for backup, immediately alerting the control center that something was wrong. The prison alarm started to sound in the distance, sending shockwaves through the facility. William's heart raced as he heard the sound of sirens approaching. There was no turning back now. He looked at King and Davis, his eyes filled with determination. The escape had been flawless so far, but now it was a race against time. The guards were closing in. They knew that the only way to survive was to keep moving fast. They reached the final section of the fence where they had planned to cut through the wire. The electrified fence loomed large in front of them, the metal gleaming in the low light. But just as they began to cut through it, the spotlights from the tower overhead flashed on, bathing the yard in a blinding glow. The escape was no longer a secret. They had been spotted. The 3 men raced toward the gate. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, the adrenaline surging through their veins. Behind them, the sound of guards rushing to intercept them grew louder. Williams led the charge, pushing forward with everything he had. But just as they reached the final wall, they saw something they hadn't expected. A second line of security, heavily armed guards, positioned near the outer perimeter. The inmates were now surrounded on all sides. The officers closed in, shouting orders to stop and surrender, but it was too late. The desperation in the air was palpable. Williams, King, and Davis had no choice but to make a stand. They could either surrender and face their fate or fight their way out, risking everything for a chance at freedom. But as the guards began to close in, the unthinkable happened. A single shot rang out. A guard had fired into the air, but it wasn't just a warning shot. The bullets started flying. A chaotic exchange of gunfire broke out, and in the confusion, one of the guards was struck. The air was thick with the crackle of gunfire, the tension so intense it could be felt in every corner of the prison yard. Inmates dove for cover, trying to protect themselves from the onslaught of police fire. For a moment, everything felt like a blur. The screams, the gunshots, the fear. Williams, King, and Davis pushed forward, moving as quickly as possible. But the reality was undeniable. Freedom was slipping away, but just as the chaos escalated, something unexpected happened. The perimeter alarms suddenly stopped. There was silence. The gunfire ceased. The spotlights flickered, and the world seemed to freeze. The prisoners, desperate for a way out, realized that the guards had stopped firing. Had they been ordered to hold back? In that brief moment of confusion, Williams saw his chance. He turned to his fellow escapees and shouted, "Move now!" With everything they had, they charged toward the final fence, their legs carrying them faster than they'd ever run before. But even as they neared freedom, the guards weren't backing down. The final confrontation was about to become a blood-soaked standoff, one that would determine if they would ever see the outside world again. The sound of gunfire echoed through the yard as Williams, King, and Davis sprinted toward the final barrier. The guards were closing in fast, but the men pushed forward with everything they had, fueled by adrenaline and the desperate desire for freedom. Williams could feel the heat of the gunfire at his back, the fear gnawing at him. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. Just as the men reached the last barbed wire fence, something changed. The guards hesitated just for a moment. In that split second, they managed to tear through the last obstacle, running at full speed toward the open field beyond the prison gates. But that moment of hesitation wasn't enough. The second line of security was ready, and the inmates' only path to freedom quickly turned into a trap. The guards, now positioned in strategic locations, had their weapons aimed directly at the escapees. Davis was the first to reach the opening, but just as he was about to cross into the open field, he was struck by a bullet. His body slammed into the ground, and the others turned to see him fall. The hope that had been ignited moments earlier now began to dim. Williams and King looked at each other, their hearts racing. The choice had never been more desperate: continue running and risk getting gunned down, or turn back and face the consequences of their rebellion. But in that moment of chaos, Williams made a decision. He turned to King and shouted, "Keep going." He pushed forward, knowing that if he didn't act now, the rebellion would have been for nothing. Williams' sprint was powerful, his body screaming for rest, but he didn't stop. He was so close to freedom, so close to the life he had dreamed of for so long. But fate wasn't on his side. As he approached the gates, the sound of gunshots rang out again. Williams stumbled, his body faltering as he felt the sharp pain of a bullet tearing into his side. He collapsed to the ground, falling just feet from the final stretch to freedom. King, realizing that the men were not going to make it out alive, hesitated. He turned back, his face filled with anger and fear, but he knew it was too late. The prison's gates were locked, and the escape was over. The men had fought for their freedom, but in the end, it was all for nothing. The rebellion had been crushed. As the authorities stormed the yard, a bloody aftermath unfolded. Williams, Davis, and King were left in the dirt, their blood staining the concrete. The chaos that had started as a fight for justice, a plea for basic human dignity, ended in tragic bloodshed. The three men who had sparked a rebellion were now prisoners of the state once again. The authorities, now in full control, gathered up the remaining inmates, locking them back into their cells. The media arrived to cover the aftermath, but the real story was hidden beneath the headlines. The real tragedy was the lack of change. Nothing had improved in the prison system. The rebellion had been a cry for reform, but the government's heavy-handed response only cemented the reality: nothing would change. Governor Nelson Rockefeller addressed the nation, but his words were hollow. The prison was back under control, but the cost of the rebellion, the lives lost, and the hopelessness that remained, was felt across the nation. In the years that followed, the voices of the men who fought for reform became more of a symbol than anything else. The blood spilled in that prison yard was a stark reminder that the prison system was broken. The uprising was a wake-up call, one that the country was unwilling to answer. Ending twist, the prisoners may have been silenced, but their message never truly died. Williams, King, and Davis became martyrs in the fight for prison reform, and their actions forced a national conversation about the treatment of inmates in U.S. prisons. Yet, decades later, the same issues remain, the system is still broken, and the fight for justice is far from over. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for what's next, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next jaw-dropping true crime story.